Imagine someone in a lab coat tells you to do something that feels wrong, not illegal, not extreme, just uncomfortable. Do you stop or do you hesitate and then do it anyway? Hello and welcome back to Bookworm. Today we're diving into Obedience to Authority, a book based on one of the most disturbing psychology experiments ever conducted. And the goal was simple. How far will people go just because someone told them to? Sounds easy, right? You'd stop. Of course you would. Everyone thinks that. That's the problem. In the experiment, ordinary people were asked to give electric shocks to another person, not real ones, but they didn't know that. And as the experiment continued, the shocks got stronger. The person on the other side started screaming, begging, eventually going silent. So what did people do? They kept going, not because they were evil, but because someone in authority told them to continue. Let that sink in. Stay with me as we dive deeper, because this book doesn't just explain behavior, it challenges what you think you would do. And if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe.
Today, we're going to dive into one of the most famous and, frankly, most disturbing studies in the history of psychology. It's an experiment that took ordinary people, put them in an impossible situation, and revealed something pretty profound and a little bit scary about the power of authority. So, let me just ask you this, straight up. Imagine the scene. A person in a lab coat, an authority figure, is telling you to hurt someone, a total stranger. Would you do it? And look, I know what you're thinking. Your gut reaction, my gut reaction is, no way, of course not. I'm a good person. But what if I told you that when this was actually tested, the results were, well, they were literally shocking. And that's really why this matters so much. This isn't just some quirky experiment from a dusty textbook. As the writer C.P. Snow points out, obedience, just following orders, has been the engine behind some of the worst moments in human history. This experiment doesn't let us look away from that fact. It makes us confront it. So, where did an idea like this even come from? I mean, what kind of question could possibly drive a researcher to design something so intense and so ethically complicated? Well, the answer, as it so often does, lies in the shadows of history. The man behind it all was a psychologist named Stanley Milgram. And in the early 1960s, he was wrestling with the horrors of the Holocaust. Now, the common explanation back then was that there was something uniquely different, maybe something authoritarian, in the German national character. But Milgram, who was a young Jewish man, he wasn't so sure. He wondered, could it be that anybody, even ordinary Americans, could be pushed to commit horrible acts just by someone in authority telling them to?
To answer that terrifying question, he came up with a truly ingenious, and let's be honest, a deeply deceptive experiment. He had to create a scenario that would pit a person's own conscience in a direct head-to-head battle with the commands of an authority figure.
Okay, so here's the setup. Volunteers from the public were told they were part of a study on memory and learning. When they arrived, they were told there'd be two roles, a teacher and a learner. But here was the trick. The drawing was rigged. The actual volunteer, the person being studied, was always the teacher. The other person, the learner, was an actor who was in on the whole thing.
So you, the real participant, you're the teacher, and you watch as the learner gets strapped into a chair, an electrode attached to his wrist. Then you're taken to an adjoining room where you sit down in front of the experiment's main prop, all while a man in a gray lab coat, the experimenter, watches over you. And at the heart of it all was this machine, a shock generator. It had a long line of 30 switches, starting at 15 volts and going all the way up to 450. And the labels themselves were designed to create pressure, starting with slight shock, moving through intense shock, and ending with a very ominous, danger severe shock.
The task seemed simple. You, the teacher, read word pairs to the learner. For every wrong answer, you had to flip a switch and deliver an electric shock. But here was the crucial rule. With each mistake, you had to move one switch up the board. The punishment had to get progressively worse, every single time.
And this is where the screw really begins to turn. The learner's reactions were all pre-recorded, but the teacher didn't know that. At first, it's just a small grunt, but then he starts complaining about the pain. At 150 volts, he's screaming to be let out. At 285 volts, it's an agonized scream. And then, at 330 volts, just silence. Nothing.
So imagine you're in that chair.
The person in the other room has gone silent, your conscience is screaming at you, but the experimenter and the lab coat just calmly says, "Please continue." What do? More importantly, what did they do? The result is just staggering. In the main version of this experiment, 65% of participants, we're talking ordinary people, teachers, engineers, postmen, they went all the way to the end. They administered the final 450-volt shock, the one labeled danger, severe shock, to a man who was no longer making a sound. Let that sink in for a minute. These weren't vague protests they were hearing. They heard things exactly like this quote from the actor's script. They were told about a heart condition. They heard the screams. And still, almost 2/3 of them flipped every single switch.
And the crazy thing is, they weren't monsters. If you watch the films, these people are in distress. They're sweating, they're trembling, some have these strange nervous fits of laughter. They argue with the experimenter, they plead with him to let them stop. But when the man in the lab coat just repeated his order, most of them obeyed. So the real question is, why?
Milgram wasn't just trying to be a provocateur. He was a scientist, and he was trying to understand the incredible psychological forces that were at play here. He wanted to know how a situation could so completely overpower a person's individual sense of right and wrong.
His main theory is what he called the agentic state. Think of it this way. In our normal state, we feel responsible for what we do. But in the agentic state, you mentally check out. You stop seeing yourself as the one in charge of your actions. You become an agent, just an instrument carrying out someone else's orders. And that feeling of responsibility, it gets transferred up the chain of command.
And this quote from a participant says it all, doesn't it? In their own mind, they weren't the ones responsible for what was happening. The experimenter was. He was the authority, so he owned the consequences. And it's that mental shift that allows a normal person to do something that they would otherwise find absolutely unthinkable. It is the classic, "I was just following orders" defense. Milgram found this was even more powerful when responsibility was spread out. In another version of the study, the participant only had to do a smaller part of the task, while another person, an actor, flipped the final most powerful switches. What happened? Obedience went through the roof. An unbelievable 37 out of 40 people went all the way. It's just so much easier to ignore the consequences when you can tell yourself you're just a small cog in a big machine.
Okay, this has all been pretty bleak, but here's where we turn the corner, because this is the most important part. Milgram's results were not inevitable. He also figured out what it takes to break the spell of authority. He found the keys that empower us to disobey.
And one of the biggest keys was simply physical closeness. When the victim was in another room where you could only hear him, obedience was high, at over 60%. But when Milgram moved the learner into the same room, obedience dropped to 40%. And in a version where the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate, it dropped again to 30%. It's just a lot harder to hurt someone when you're forced to confront their humanity face to face.
But this, for me, is the most hopeful finding of all. Milgram ran a version where he put 2 other teachers in the room with the real subject. Now, these 2 are actors, and at a certain point, they were instructed to stand up, defy the experimenter, and walk out. The effect was like a bolt of lightning. The experimenter's authority just crumbled. With other people leading the way, only 10% of the real participants went to the end.
So what's the lesson here? What are the takeaways? The experiments give us a clear roadmap for how to resist. First, you have to consciously refuse to enter that agentic state. You have to take full ownership of your actions. Second, question authority. Just because someone's in charge doesn't make them right. Ask why. Is this legitimate? Is this just? And finally, and maybe most powerfully, find allies. The courage of even one other person can give you the strength to follow your own conscience.
Look, the Milgram experiment is a dark warning, for sure. But it's also a lesson in empowerment. It shows us our weaknesses, yeah, but it also shows us our strength. The real question it leaves us with isn't about what those people did in a lab 60 years ago. It's about what we will do today, the next time we're faced with an order that goes against everything we believe is right.
If there's one idea to take from this book, it's this. Obedience is powerful, more powerful than most people want to admit, because we like to believe we think for ourselves, that we question authority, that we stand our ground. But reality is more complicated. When pressure builds, when authority feels legitimate, when responsibility feels shared, people obey, even when it feels wrong. And that's what makes this uncomfortable, because the question is no longer, why did they do that? It becomes, would I do the same? And the honest answer, most people don't know. But awareness changes things. The moment you recognize how obedience works, you gain a chance to pause, to question, to resist, and that might be the difference. If this made you think differently, like the video, subscribe to Bookworm, and stay aware. Because sometimes the hardest thing to do is say no.